G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Oh boy, what a week. If you're feeling a bit unstable and discombobulated, if you've been consuming a little too much cable news and too much chatter around the dinner table about the past few days' events, I hear you, I'm feeling you. The dangerous idea that I invite you to consider in the midst of all that, which might help us lift ourselves above it for a moment and not just listen to cable news anchors barking on about ballistics, is that in the wake of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, I noticed that we're on a knife edge in two ways. The first is just the contingency of history. I mean, the distance between where we currently are and an America that looks very, very, very different is a distance of an inch and a half in ballistics terms. You know, like AR-15s are very powerful. 8 shots were fired. One was close enough to sever his ear. He just had to move a fraction. The wind just had to be slightly different. A butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon had to just behave slightly differently. And the breeze coming from the northeast could have been slightly stronger. I mean, you know, if his head had exploded like a watermelon, pardon the analogy, but, you know, I'm not in favor of AR-15, so that's the bluntest way of putting it. Where would we be then? So no matter how kind of, I don't know, unstable or vulnerable or anxious we might be feeling at the moment about this election, just remember that there are a lot of parallel universes in which it's a lot better and a lot of parallel universes in which it's a lot worse. And at juncture points, like the Trump attempted assassination, that's a moment where you can viscerally see history splitting into two, and you can see all of the other ways that that could have gone. And the second thing that's just present for me is a sense of, could this event be shot number 2 in some slowly unfolding gunfight that will become, a problematic time in American history, shall we say. Shot number 1 might have been January 6th. And if you imagine like a gangland shootout between goodies and baddies, not having been involved in a gangland shootout myself, it's mostly informed by like 1970s sitcom versions of it, where there are some baddies hunkered behind a Cadillac and some cops hunkered behind a cop car, one of whom was just about to retire the next day. But if you imagine that like escalating from like the first person shoots one shot and then, you know, another one scurries around to the back and then another shot is shot, and it gradually escalates from being one shot every 12 seconds to a rat-a-tat fire of 50 shots a second. Slow that down over the course of years. And, you know, we've seen this happen time and time again throughout history, where things just gradually escalate in slow motion. And, you know, January 6th turns into the attempted assassination of Trump, turns into greater hostility on both sides. And I mean, I think part of what we all have to do is to take a deep breath, you know, step back, be a little bit philosophical about things, not allow ourselves to get pulled into a partisan melee, because that's what gives support to the shots getting faster and hotter. I mean, on the question of the contingency of it all, it almost feels like Archduke Franz Ferdinand's limousine taking the wrong turn and therefore giving an opportunity to his assassin and to just randomly shoot him after the previous assassination attempt had failed, thereby sparking off World War I, which sparked off World War II, which sparked off the Holocaust, which sparked off the Cold War, and on and on and on. So yeah, let's first of all spare a thought for the 50-year-old father who was killed while sheltering his family in the crowd. Spare a thought also to the family of the 20-year-old shooter. You don't know anything at 20. You are also a human being, and you also have loved ones. The contingency of this moment, the ways it could have gone another way, is of course not just applicable when you have a literal near miss, a literal situation where a bullet that is fired out of a gun at whatever it is, 3,000 feet per second, goes within an inch of a brain, but also just moments that you know could have gone differently because they were close. I mean, the 537 votes in Florida in the year 2000 that could have gone to Al Gore, and then 9/11 either may have been caught because you'd have wonks in the White House who paid attention to memos like bin Laden determined to strike inside United States, which was literally the title of one of the memos that came across George W. Bush's desk in the summer of 2001. Or if they didn't catch it and 9/11 still happened, maybe the response would not have been an ambitious plan to remake the Middle East into a democracy and to nation build for decades. Maybe the plan would have been an environmental one, since it was Al Gore's number one issue, to try to wean ourselves off Middle Eastern oil and say, all right, guys, it's been a nice century of us giving you money for that, but we're going to go our own way now, and we're going to invest heavily into renewables, and you can go back to doing whatever you were doing before we started giving you oil money. There are so many different ways that history could have gone that it raises this timeless question that fascinates me about whether history is shaped by people or whether it's shaped by forces. I mean, it's obviously shaped by both, but like, where is the needle there? Like, it's hamburger helper. Where's the beef and where's the filler? How much is the great person doing great things or terrible things, and how much is just the soil that they're growing out of? So I mean, do the thought experiment about Trump, right? And again, I want to reiterate, thoughts go out to the 50-year-old guy who was killed. Thoughts even go out to the shooter. And of course, my thoughts go out to Donald Trump. I mean, he's a human being. He doesn't deserve to be put into that situation. He has a family. And as has been repeated ad nauseum since the event, political violence is always wrong. And I'll get into that in a second. Because I don't think it's as obvious as everybody who claims that it is, that political violence should be wrong. So, let's assume that things had gone worse and that Trump was actually killed or, incapacitated to the extent that he could no longer run. So what then happens? Like in your great man theory of history, where you've got forces that are much, much deeper and broader than the great man themselves. You've got frustration with the border. You've got resentment towards elites. You've got a sense of disenfranchisement. You've got a hollowing out of the middle class. You've got a failure to lift up industries in places like Appalachia, that have been sort of left behind by history. You've got the opioid epidemic. You've got the rise of China. You've got globalization. You've got growing inequality. You've got social media. You've got artificial intelligence. Like, into that soup, Trump, as this kind of shape-shifting, really frankly brilliant and quite brave populist, emerges out of that in a way that I find to be morally noxious and pathetic and pandering, but is nonetheless, you would have to give the man credit, quite astute and quite he's a man with an incredible political instinct. Just look at his reaction to the shooting, by the way. The way that you know that Donald Trump's success is not calculated is by noticing how he behaves in moments that he could not have calculated for, when fight or flight kicks in and all he's doing is responding to instinct. And I don't know how many people, really, to be fair, to give the man credit, would have, after having been shot in a state of shock, instead of getting the hell out of there, used that as a reason to dredge up your inner strength and just responded like a pit bull dog with that anger in his face that you can see in those photos and in the video, punching his fist in the air, screaming, fight, fight. For him, it's like, you're not going to fucking get me down. Like, this is a mission for him, even if it's a mission devoid of any principle except win. Even that mission, I find, you got to hand it to the man. I mean, he loses in 2020. He comes back for more. He's the Energizer Bunny. He's going on and on and on. He's not giving up. So nonetheless, you put that character into this garden, right? And what kind of tree does it grow into? You remove that character, that seed, and what tree do you get instead? What garden do you get instead? If Donald Trump had been assassinated, I don't think you get a world without Trumpism. I think it's quite likely that you get a much more dangerous America, at least in the short and medium term, because what you're not doing is addressing the causes that are giving rise to it, right? Like the job of a society and of a healthy demos is to try to release pressure valves, to try to notice the steam building up inside the pressure cooker and find ways to release that by ultimately addressing the legitimate grievances of the people who are pissed off for some reason. Think about the French election, think about the UK election, think about the rise of the far right in general. The times when societies fall apart and things really go to hell is when, instead of addressing underlying issues of inequality and disenfranchisement and a sense of, not being represented and not moving ahead, you instead try to paper over them and try to tell people that they're idiots. And that has been part of the Democratic mistake, I think, for a long time. I mean, had the Democrats not done that in 2016 quite so much, then another contingent event that is a sort of fork in the road of history, a sliding doors moment, just as much as this one feels like, is the election of Donald Trump in the first place. Which brings me to today's conversation. David Frum and I spoke before Donald Trump, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. So much of this will sound completely tin-eared to today's moment, and yet so much of it is so overwhelmingly relevant that we may not have even had the perspicacity to say it if we'd known what was happening, because we would have spent an hour swimming around in the soup of Donald Trump's attempted assassination, which ultimately is not going to be nearly as important to history as the question of who wins the election in November, what happens to the Democratic Party, what happens to the Republican Party, and what happens to the future of American democracy, which are the issues that David Frum is touching on with me. You probably know Frum. He's a senior editor at The Atlantic. He was the first person inside the George W. Bush White House to write an insider's account of George W. Bush's presidency. He was an extremely important figure in the 2000s in American politics, and subsequently as an analyst and a journalist. He is credited with coming up with the phrase "the axis of evil," which George W. Bush gave to much criticism and acclaim in the first State of the Union after the September 11th terrorist attacks, which basically framed this kind of worldview of the Bush administration. And so Frum is no stranger to forks in the road, to black swan events. I mean, he was there for 9/11. He helped shape America's response to that to some extent, or at least the selling of that response, including the Iraq War. Sadly, we don't get into a lot of this kind of sliding doors stuff, but he does say some really interesting things about how differently we would be understanding the world if random things like Donald Trump winning in 2016 had gone the other way. Like, humans are great meaning-making machines, and so we like to regard the historically contingent scenario that we're currently in to be the one that was always going to happen, and therefore we overlearn lessons that maybe we don't need to learn. Like, there's an evolutionary benefit to us trying to impute meaning to things, to us trying to impute agency to something rustling in the leaves behind us if we're on the African savannah, which is one reason why we think that there's more mystery and mysticism and like a kind of more agency going on in the wonders of the world than there probably actually is, in terms of being psychic or tarot cards or astrology or whatever it might be. But at the same time, we're not very good at going, well, you know what? I mean, someone was going to win the 2016 election, and the bullet's trajectory was going to go somewhere, and, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was going to drive down some street, but it didn't actually have to be that street, and had it not been that street and had he not been shot, would the Great War still have happened? I mean, it's an interesting question. Probably something would have happened because of all of those underlying forces that I was just talking about. You have a scenario into which the great man or the great event or the random moment, the inciting incident can step. But our job is to notice that there are an infinite number of possible futures, and it's within our power to choose which one is likelier to unfold. It's not within our power to choose the best of all possible futures. All we can do is make small decisions that contribute to a greater good that points us into the direction of likelier, better scenarios, right? Because it would obviously have been possible in some way to de-escalate and do things differently prior to the Holocaust, such that Hitler was not able to get away with killing quite as many Jews and Roma and gays and everyone as he did. Like there are many, many, many more universes one would have to imagine in which the Holocaust doesn't happen than in which it does. And there are probably some in which, obviously many, in which the Holocaust happens on a global scale or humankind wipes itself out thanks to nuclear weapons. As an aside, I think this failure of ours to appreciate the contingency of the situation that we live in and the accidentalness of history is one of the reasons why we're so cavalier and blasé about nuclear weapons, because we just happen to live in a world where we got pretty lucky on a number of occasions in the 20th century, where we came quite close to things falling apart, and they really could have, and then they didn't, and we all breathed a collective sigh of relief and said, oh, well, see, we can sort of manage these things. We're pretty good at it. Maybe, or maybe not. Maybe we just happen to live in the world in which, the bullet grazed the ear of the metaphorical nuclear holocaust instead of being an inch and a half to the right and exploding the person's, okay, I'm giving up that metaphor. That's too much, right? Exploding the metaphorical brain of the Cold War and annihilating us all. So the question of what happens next, right? The great man theory versus a more deterministic one. Could 9/11 not have happened? Could it have been responded to differently? Forget it. That's right. So 2016 is where I was going with this, because David Frum says something really interesting about this. I want to elaborate on it in advance in a way that I would have elaborated on it had the assassination attempt happened before we spoke. 11 days before the election in 2016, the director of the FBI, as I'm sure you know, felt that it was prudent for him to release and announce that he was investigating emails that came to light in the course of an unrelated criminal investigation of Anthony Weiner, emails that may have involved something to do with Hillary Clinton. This left Americans wondering what the emails contained, who sent them, what connection they might have to the investigation that the FBI had closed months previously without recommending criminal charges. If that hadn't happened, could Hillary Clinton have gotten across the line in just Pennsylvania and Ohio, which is all she would have needed? Or if not Pennsylvania, then Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin? If the Democrats hadn't nominated someone as clunky a campaigner as Hillary Clinton, someone as sort of seemingly wooden and alienating, someone as difficult for voters to get behind, if indeed they'd nominated Joe Biden 8 years ago when he had all his marbles, would he have been a stronger candidate against Donald Trump? Or Bernie Sanders? All these questions are more than just like sliding doors hypotheticals, because to try to answer them helps us understand where to go from here. To try to answer them teases apart the great man / inciting great incident version of history from the general trends, sort of materialist worldview of fatalism or determinism about human history, regardless of who does it. So if Trump had lost in 2016, then the Republican Party and many Republican voters would have said, well, I guess in hindsight that was stupid, wasn't it? We shouldn't do that. People don't like that. It was kind of obvious that he was going to lose. So, forget about that. We'll go back to the center. That would have solved things for a while. For how long? Who would have been the next person to come along and tap the sense of disenfranchisement that white working class, non-college educated voters largely at the time feel? The Trump coalition has expanded since then, especially to include Hispanics and more black people. But at the time, that was the overwhelming demographic. So who else would have tapped that? And could they have been actually a savvier manipulator than Donald Trump? If it was Tucker Carlson, in other words, someone who I think is equally good as Trump at manipulating people and at articulating a sort of panicked, paranoid worldview in a way that resonates with people who are susceptible to panic and paranoia. But someone who knew the White House better, who knew politics better, who knew what you had to do to get things done. I mean, this is part of the concern of a second Trump term, that he is surrounding himself now with people in places like the Heritage Foundation who understand politics, they understand policy, and they've got in place the plans that are ready to go that he didn't have in in Trump's first term. So all of this is to come to my final point, which is the injunction against political violence. We're supposed to say after moments like this that this is a tragedy and political violence has no place in America. This was the first thing that President Biden said. This is un-American. Violence has no place in America. This runs contrary to everything we believe in. Blah, 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 blah. It's bullshit. It absolutely has a place in America if you're talking descriptively. Political violence and the idea that you can take up arms against rulers or candidates who you don't like has a long history in the United States. I mean, many would argue that it's foundational to the founding principles of the United States to use violence to overthrow people and leaders who you think are doing the wrong thing. I'm not saying that it should be that way. I'm saying that descriptively it is that way. So if all of this kind of talk about this is not who we are as Americans, is a code for that I as a non-American am not getting for, like, let us pretend that this is not the way that we are because we should all agree that it is not the way that we ought to be, then I'm with you. But it would be nice to hear someone say that. I mean, it would be nice to hear someone on cable news or someone in politics go, this is a scourge that has been with us, been with America since day one. It's one of our founding sins that we struggle with. I can understand that there is a long and somewhat honorable tradition of, like, the independence of the individual and standing up to powerful people who they disagree with, sometimes even violently. What is it that Jefferson was claimed to have said about, the blood of, tyrants needs to be refreshed every few generations to keep the branch of democracy, blah-de-blah, alive, whatever. From Oklahoma City to many, 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 to January 6th, frankly. There are many occasions on which there's an American reverence for political violence. So I think you need to do better than simply saying it's not who we are. I think you need to explain why it shouldn't be who we are. So let me give it a brief crack. I mentioned that you need a release valve from extremism, or rather a release valve from the underlying grievances that can give rise to extremism, right? You can't just suppress and put a lid on the extremism forever. You have to have a way of resolving the underlying issues and letting the pressure cooker out a bit. One analogy that David Frum makes in this piece, which I think is really interesting, and he explains it there, so I won't here, is that America may be about to become a little bit like Italy in the 1970s, and look forward to his explanation of what that means. But the upside of that is that Italy is now a perfectly functioning country and has a quote-unquote far-right government, and it's still doing fine. The injunction on political violence is not because it can never have a net positive effect. Like, you can game plan out the various futures in which Donald Trump had been successfully assassinated, in which, everyone had sort of seen the impact that an AR-15 bullet can do. And by the way, these bullets do some incredible, incredible things. I mean, they do come out of the muzzle 3 times faster than a 9mm handgun bullet. And you can read, there was an amazing piece, I think it was in The Atlantic in 2016, by a radiologist. This was in the wake of was it the Uvalde shooting? I mean, there are so many shootings in America, but you read some of the accounts of medical practitioners, and in this case, a radiologist who's looking at the x-rays and is quite familiar with gunshot wounds, where the gunshot just goes, from a handgun, goes tracing through. You can see it like a line. It's like someone's drawn a line across the body when you x-ray the side of the body. AR-15 bullets are totally different. They might not even come close to a bone, and the bone will just fracture. It'll turn into powder. It'll go near the liver, and the liver turns into just a lump of jello, because they're going so fast, and because of the way that they're designed, they can, if they touch something, they create these ripple effects that go out and just, they leave a hole, unlike a normal bullet, which will just go straight through you. They'll leave a hole in the back of the person that's the size of an orange. It's a catastrophe. It's a mess. I don't want to put horrible thoughts in your head, especially this close to bedtime. But, a head that has had an AR-15 bullet go through, the edge of its skull is not just like, oh, well, maybe we can stitch it back up. No, that's That's a watermelon dropped from a skyscraper. So suppose that had happened and everyone had seen it and had gone out on social media before, the platforms could delete it. Certainly the people there would have seen it. It's not at all clear to me that the America after we get rid of Trump that way is any better than the America beforehand, right? I mean, you can see that. There would be at least some kind of low-grade civil war. There would be massive civil unrest. There would be incredible paranoia. There's already conspiracy theories on the right about this, event having been the deep state trying to take out Donald Trump, the Biden's deep state trying to get rid of him. And there's conspiracy theories on the left. This was staged. This is a way for him to improve his popularity. Maybe it was an inside job. I don't think there's any reason to believe either of those. When the most parsimonious explanation by far is that a lot of people have a lot of reason to dislike Donald Trump, and some of those people want to take violence into their own hands. But just think about what the conspiracy theorizing would be if it had been successful, right? And you'd at least have some kind of martial law, police, cities on lockdown, flaming riots everywhere. And what emerges from that, what kind of populist emerges from that, is hard to say. So you'd have to be at best agnostic about whether or not it would have been a good thing. And again, I know this sounds kind of callous, like obviously it would be a bad thing to murder a man. Like, I'm taking that as a moral given. I'm trying not to do all of the boring throat clearing of like, well, it would have been tragic. In America, we don't do this, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, of course, killing a person is wrong. I'm trying to understand what the bigger ramifications are, because if we're all honest with ourselves, we would have to acknowledge that it could sometimes have a net positive effect to kill somebody, right? I mean, if you want to go in extremis here, there's the whole question of like going back and killing, Adolf Hitler just before the Holocaust. If you knew you could do that and you knew that he wouldn't be replaced by a more effective leader, that you could basically get the Nazis out of power, for example, in like 1939, would you kill someone to do that? I mean, of course you would. You'd be morally insane not to. So I can understand the appeal of thinking, well, why not create a better future if it's possible to do so, even if you have to break a few eggs along the way? Here's why not. The injunction on political violence is not there because there's never an instance in which political violence could have a positive effect. It's there because the moment you give a skerrick of credibility to the idea that individuals can take political violence into their own hands, you begin unraveling the stability of civilization that we've worked pretty bloody hard to erect. You open the door to Rwanda and the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia and societal collapse. Like, we've established quite a sophisticated and nuanced balance here. It's really unusual. You are, if you live in a Western liberal democracy, one of the luckiest people ever to walk the face of this earth, statistically speaking. You're healthier, wealthier, you live longer, you're freer from random crime. You have a wider range of things to eat, you have more creature comforts, you have better technology. And largely that's come about through free markets and the Enlightenment and Western liberal democracy. And I'm sure you could add a whole bunch of awful things like colonialism or whatever, but I think those were tangential to the innovation that's happened over the past few centuries. And that the prerequisite for that innovation is a certain amount of stability and a certain amount of privacy and a certain amount of property law and impartial courts and, a judiciary that functions independently and democratic institutions and a separation of powers and freedom of thought. And all of that stuff is quite a difficult quilt to stitch. It's a hard jigsaw puzzle to put together. And we've managed to do it, partly through luck and partly through our own doing. And there are certain fundamental principles that are necessary to uphold to keep that whole thing together, to keep that structure in place. It's a Jenga tower, and you can't pull out. There are some pieces that you can sort of mess around with at the top, which we're messing around with at the moment, I think, sort of norms and things like that, and politeness, and, will Trump do this or will Trump do that? And should you prosecute a sitting president? What's the Supreme Court going to do? And abortion this and whatever. I think these are all small pieces at the top of the Jenga puzzle, but there are big pieces at the bottom of the Jenga tower, which if you pull them out, everything falls apart. And one of those is you don't shoot people to get your way. You just don't do that. It's a little bit like the injunction against terrorism, yeah, or even torture, you might say. So, the terrorist can say, on what grounds can you possibly say that I shouldn't blow up a school bus or a shopping center or an aeroplane when, the might of the United States has been dropping bombs and killing people all over the world all the time? Like, I'm killing far fewer civilians. Granted, it sounds hypocritical, it's clumsy, but the fact is that once you open the door to saying that individuals should be allowed to kill other individuals to make a political point, everything falls apart. Everything doesn't necessarily fall apart if militaries get to do military things overseas. Like, sucks to be overseas, but as far as a policy is concerned, that is not fundamental to, an injunction against using any force ever is not what's important. What's important is an injunction on outsourcing the use of force to official systems like police, courts, and the military. We don't do it ourselves as civilians. That's the fundamental principle. Even if you can point to examples where it would be in isolation prudent to do so. Think of it's a little bit like the job of a defense attorney or something who gets hired by very wealthy criminal gangs to get them off. The principle of the defense attorney who can sleep at night is not like, oh, it's a great thing that I'm getting off criminals. It's that I am a cog in a system, and the system is a justice system. And in order for the justice system to work, everybody has to get a good defense. All I'm doing is defending them, and the system goes on. Now, you might have qualms with that particular moral calculation in isolation, but you presumably don't have qualms with the idea of there existing a justice system in which people are able to be defended by whoever they want or can afford to defend them. Another one, I suppose, that comes to mind is invading countries. You hear a lot of the talk about, from Putin apologists and people even like Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson and Russell Brand and whoever, they're like, well, what about all the bad stuff we've done? We expanded NATO, we penned in Putin. Okay, great. All of that stuff is taking place away from the Jenga tower. Like, that is taking place on the game board of acceptable behavior of a liberal world order. We have a rule that a country doesn't get to invade another country and keep its land, right? That's just a rule. Now, there may be really valid reasons for doing so. Elon Musk might tweet about how Ukraine was just Khrushchev's mistake, which was a Putin talking point that he somehow got, that he tweeted out, because, when the USSR, when Ukraine was part of USSR, then Khrushchev shouldn't have given it as much autonomy as it had, and it would kind of turn it into becoming this other country, but it shouldn't really have ever been another country. It should always have remained part of Russia at the end of the USSR, blah, 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 blah. You can wax lyrical until the cows come home. The fact is, we have a rule. The rule is what's important. Not questioning the rule is what's important. Like us all going, okay, I'll grant you all that. I'll grant you everything about the illegitimacy of Ukraine. I'll grant you everything about the historical contingency of it being a different country. I'll grant you everything about how threatened Russia feels by the fact that NATO has expanded. And still, in this world, we have a rule. It's a big piece at the bottom of the Jenga tower. You don't roll tanks into a neighboring country to try to just absorb that country into your own. Like, one of the reasons why it's hard to uphold these rules is because we all try to get away with as much fudging of the rules as we possibly can. People will point to the Iraq invasion, for example. Well, that was illegal. That was in contravention of international law. There was no Security Council resolution that the United States and, the UK and Australia and whatever other toadies were going along with it should be able to invade Iraq. So, well, if it's what's good for the goose is good for the gander, if the US can do it, why can't we do it? Well, yeah, the difference here is that the US didn't want to keep Iraq. Yeah, they wanted a friendly regime in Iraq. They didn't want Saddam Hussein in power. They were doing their own geostrategic games, and they shouldn't have done it. And obviously, I think a majority of Americans now think that they shouldn't have done it. It was a stupid move, and indeed the man who I'm speaking to in this episode was one of the people there trying to sell that move. And I spoke to him about that in the first instance that he was on the show. So you can go back and listen to both if you like this episode, which I'm sure you will. But the difference with the Iraq War is America was not going to keep Iraq. It was not going to turn it into the 51st state of the United States. So there are basic rules that we have to, not question. And one of them is political violence. And I think I would like, you can imagine if there was an Obama in the White House, you can imagine him making this point without making the point as clumsily as I am, but alluding to it in a way that Joe Biden doesn't have the capacity to do. You think back to Obama's speech about race in the lead up to his election, to his first election. And, there was this recording that came out of a pastor at a church that he used to go to saying, some anti-American things and supposedly anti-white things. And this became a big thing on the right. And Obama decided, I have to finally, I have to give this speech about being a black guy in America. I have to find a way to do this, and without throwing my pastor under the bus. And it's this amazing speech that you should go back and watch, where he tries to straddle, white and black and red and blue, and say things are complicated, but we should all be able to agree on certain principles. You can imagine him doing that here. You can imagine him saying, I get the frustration, I get the anger, and I get the hurt, and I get the tradition in this country of saying, damn it, I'm fed up and I'm not going to take it anymore, and I shouldn't need to. And I understand the deranged moral calculus that might come into play, where you think that the world is going to be better off if you can achieve your goals and get rid of the other guy by stepping outside of the game altogether and breaking the rules. But we have rules for a reason. Like, we're Americans for a reason. We have to stick together because there's nowhere else to go. Like, we are a country. We are a demos. Let's understand that history is contingent. Understand that this was an accidental moment, but maybe a warning. And let's try to heed the warning in some way. I spend much of the beginning of this conversation with David Frum trying to heed the general warning of not running a geriatric, probably Parkinson's patient as the Democratic candidate. And I think it's important for us all to do the things that we think we need to do to lead us towards all of those sliding doors futures that are just a little bit better than the alternatives. I hope you're well. I hope you don't spend too much time on social media and watching the news at the moment. It's ultimately not that material. I don't think it's that consequential. At least if it is consequential, then we're not going to know for some time the way in which it's consequential. I mean, I personally think that it's a political gift to Donald Trump. I think his reaction will be iconic. The photo of him with blood smeared on his face and his fist punching the air and the American flag behind him. I mean, for me, this is like a total wipeout against Biden. But there are things that can still be done. There are things we can still do. And as you'll hear me articulate in this interview, there are reasons to believe that a Trump loss and a Trump win are not necessarily the easy black and white binary moral bad and good that we might think they are. Be gentle with yourself this week. I hope you enjoy. Oh, I should note, David Frum talks about us recording this interview sometime in advance of the Republican National Convention. We had scheduled this because I knew that the Republican National Convention was this week, and I knew that Donald Trump was going to be anointed the candidate. It was only about 3 days before the shooting, right? It was like, he says, we don't know what's going to happen. And I was sort of thinking in my head when he says, we don't know what's going to happen by the time the convention starts. How much can happen in a few days? Well, turns out a lot can happen in a few days. But just to put that in context, it's not like we were talking weeks ago. We were talking shortly before the assassination attempt and a few days before the beginning of the convention. Yeah, I hope you're well. Be gentle with yourself. Enjoy as much as I did the one and only David Frum.
Well, if we're recording, I won't.
I didn't want to put you off. Okay, but just give me the short version. So it used to be a hard scrabble farming community. Then it turns into
and it's become then it sank into deep depression because the farms were not economic in the new era of freer trade after 1988, and then it discovered this later existence as wineries, more bespoke farming, organic farming. And then artists arrived, and then it became a place where people who wanted a quieter life than in the city could come. But we've been coming here. It was originally settled by refugees from the American Revolution, loyalists, and my family has been coming here since 1990, and all my children, this is where all their memories are from.
Wow. I'd never thought about the loyalist refugees from the United States as being a possible explanation for why I find a greater level of Anglophilia in Canada than I do in Australia.
Here in Ontario, which is the central province, this is the defining, the motto of the province of Ontario is the Latin tag "Sic ut fidelis," which is a half of a tag that began "Faithful she began, faithful she remains," and the faith.
Wow!
Because this was originally settled by people who came from upstate New York and who, in the American Revolution, was a civil war as much as anything, and they were New Yorkers who made the choice to follow them.
Right.
And they immigrated to Canada so they could stay under the rule of.
That's fascinating, because I've always had a general sense that Australians are more condescending, contemptuous, and resentful towards the United Kingdom than Canadians are. But yeah, that would probably make sense. All right. Speaking of people fleeing to Canada from the United States, there's your segue, David, to November, the November elections.
A friend of mine, or an online pen pal, asked me what happens if Trump wins, and what was my advice, my personal advice to him. And my advice to him was buy a beret, grow a beard, and head to the Sierra. I still remain, despite all these recent troubles, of the view that that Trump is likely going to lose. And I can take time to explain why I still believe in that. But there's no question that we speak on the eve of the Republican convention. We speak after 2 weeks of intense criticism of President Biden following his dreadful performance at the debate. This is a moment of tremendous uncertainty. And my view that Trump is going to lose is very much the minority view.
So why have such optimism?
So from the time that Donald Trump appeared on the American scene as a serious political candidate in 2015 until today, there has never been a poll in which he got more than, at best, 47% support among Americans. He has always been at below 50%. Through all his presidency, there was not a single day when, in any credible poll, there are a couple of hack pollsters who gave him a higher mark, but in the credible pollsters, there's not a single day of his presidency where he hit the 50% number. And every time the Trump proposition has been put to the voters, it's received less than half the vote. That's what happened in 2016 when he received 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. In 2018, his party lost its majority in the House of Representatives. In 2020, he got 7 million votes fewer than Joe Biden. In 2021, his party lost the Senate, the U.S. Senate. In 2022, the Trump party had the worst midterm of any out party since the 1930s, really. And in 2023, again, Republicans who are loyal to Trump that lost a lot of state and local.
I hate to point out an uncomfortable truth, David, but the fact that he won 3 million votes more than Hillary Clinton did not mean that he didn't win fewer than Hillary Clinton did not mean that he didn't take the White House. In a parliamentary democracy, this would be fine, but given the Electoral College,
is the rules. We're asking two different questions. One question was, did he legally achieve executive power? He did. The second question is, how popular is he? So that if you want to say, why am I confident that he's stuck at 46, 47%? There's just a series of data points going back to 2015. He's stuck at 46, 47%.
Right, but I don't think I don't care what he could be polling at 2%, and I would still be alarmed if it meant that he could get enough votes in the Electoral College to become president again.
For sure. But just when you say why, so what I thought was the story of 2016, 2020, and 2024 was Trump gets 46% of the vote. In 2016, the shape of the election means that he could convert his 46% of the vote into a majority in the Electoral College. In 2020, he could not convert his 40 because it was a more binary choice. Hillary Clinton only got 48, Biden got 51. And I expected that what would happen was that the anti-Trump vote would consolidate in 2024 as it had consolidated in 2020 and as it did not consolidate in 2016. But the reason people are now so alarmed is Biden's poor performance in the debates and other things that have happened since have led many to fear intelligently that the anti-Trump vote may not consolidate and that Trump could do in 2024 what he did in 2016, which is convert 46% of the vote into an Electoral College majority.
isn't it relevant where those votes are? Even if, I mean, setting aside the question of consolidating the anti-Trump vote, we're basically talking about 4 to 6 states, aren't we? And whether or not a bunch of soccer mums bother to get up in the morning and go to the polling place or choose to blow it off.
Yeah. No, that's of course true. Look, Trump got more votes in the state of California than he got in any other half dozen states. But California is not competitive. He will get millions and millions of votes in New York, but New York State will not be competitive. And then in other states, it will be razor's edge. But if you ask me, why was I so confident that Biden or the Democratic Party would do well in 2024? That's why. But we've had a series of shocks. We've had this worrying performance by President Biden in the debate. And then his party has just turned on itself since then. And they're now at a point, as you and I speak, a little in advance of the time when you'll post the podcast. So there may be a lot of events between recording and posting. But the Democrats are now in a very awkward position where so many people of such importance have gone on record saying, we don't think Biden can do the job, that if he stays, the Trump ads write themselves. They have the New York Times editorial board saying Biden shouldn't run. They have New Yorker, every voice, George Clooney, every voice of liberal America saying Biden is past it. And if Biden somehow endures, these things will all become weapons against him wielded in the Trump campaign.
Yeah. I mean, does that mean they weren't worth doing?
My view again here is a little different from most people. My own view was, I wrote an article for The Atlantic in April arguing that Biden should not do the debate. Not because at the time I was so worried as I later was, but I just thought what we falsely call debates are actually joint media appearances, and presidents of the United States should not do joint media appearances with convicted felons. That was my view. The president should not be on the same stage as someone who tried to mount a coup d'etat against an election. He just shouldn't be there. And so my opinion, if you'd asked me, if we talked in April, I would have said what Biden should do is do a Rose Garden strategy where he comes out once a week and announces some new treaty, some new achievement, and then allows his massive war chest just to hammer Trump with negative ads, but he should never directly engage with Trump. That would have been my advice back in April. That advice was not taken. And so here we are. He did directly engage with him in a moment of extreme self-confidence where he was not honest with himself about his own state of mind. He met Trump in June. Trump didn't do so well. Trump was pretty crazy. Against any other person, Trump would have looked like a maniac. But because we were so alarmed by the president's seeming detachment from the world of the living.
I didn't get that, actually, David. My initial take was that I was as alarmed by what I perceived to be Trump's having taken on board his campaign's advice to not be a railing lunatic as I was by Biden's mental deficiencies. That it struck me, and maybe this was the format of the debate, that the mics were switched off and that the timekeepers were strict. But if I didn't know anything about politics and I just saw those two guys, I would have thought, and if I didn't know how much Trump was lying, it would seem like Trump was a human being, like rather than Trump, the Trump of Trumpistan railing against, in the first Hillary debate where Trump really seemed deranged, stalking around the stage, barking at her, like, dropping weird analogies to QAnon stuff that nobody understood. Here I thought he looked pretty presidential, which scared the shit out of me.
Yeah. No, he was not, I think you're quite right, that he wasn't, and compared to his 2020 debate where he seemed to be in a very manic phase. Look, Trump also has mental health issues and they come and go. And that was definitely not one of his more crazy days.
And just going back to the,
was just not true. But once you're having to explain to people that something isn't true, that's a little different than the candidate appearing on stage and punching a baby.
Yeah, right. Yeah. When you're explaining, you're losing. Was it Reagan who said that? Someone.
Probably Vince Lombardi.
Yeah, okay. Maybe on your point about Biden, he shouldn't have done the debate because you don't do a debate with a convicted felon. The way that would spin for 40% of the country would be, yeah, but the only reason why he's a convicted felon is because there was a case that no successful business person in that position would have been able to survive the scrutiny of the level of scrutiny that the Justice Department and state justice departments have imposed on Trump is unprecedented. And so this smells witch hunty. So it's all very convenient to unleash a bunch of investigations against a former president. And then when you manage to nail him on some arcane, like election campaign, hooker sex thing, you say, well, now I'm not going to debate him because he's beyond the pale.
Well, as to the merits of the case against him, the case on which he was convicted was not the strongest of the many cases against him and not the most morally shocking of the many cases, both criminal and civil. But there's a common theme in all of the cases, which is Trump has a long history of falsifying business records, which, by the way, reputable business people do not do. And this is a theme that goes through. The New York Times in 2018 did a big story about how the Trump family had cheated the IRS out of hundreds of millions of dollars of inheritance taxes. And the way they had done that was by generating false invoices. The business fraud case where he lied about his net worth, had told one story to the government about what his businesses were worth for tax purposes and a different story to the bankers about what his businesses were worth for lending purposes. That also all relied on false documents.
Right. But isn't that, I mean, not to excuse it, but it strikes me that really, if you dug into any billionaire, like, yeah, of course, oh, my ranch out there is worth such and such when I'm talking to the banker, but ho, get me in a private room and we're all having a port and a cigar. And, maybe your accountant is doing things and you're signing a bunch of documents and you're not really paying attention to it. If you had a prosecutor go over it with a fine-tooth comb and a microscope, I think most people's bullshit detector, and maybe this is just because most people, it's class warfare or something. I'm not saying they would do it as bad as Trump, but I'm saying that that's the narrative that you have to push back against plausibly.
I'm going to put a little rank on this because you have no reason to know this, but my family is a real estate family here in Canada, where we're speaking from, and pretty active in condominium development and other things. We don't use false invoices. We tell the same story to our bankers as we tell to the government. And not because we're such wonderful, wonderful people, but because if you don't do that, sooner or later, you will go to prison. And the assumption of everyone in the business world is you don't keep separate sets of books. Because whether or not you're ever caught for that, people who keep separate sets of books are up to criminal activities. And sooner or later, it's going to get caught. In fact, the first way I became aware of Trump as a businessman, I lived in New York in the early 90s, and of course, I knew him from Spy magazine. But Donald Trump came to Toronto in the early 2000s and opened he didn't open a hotel. A bunch of very fly-by-night operators built a hotel in downtown Toronto and paid Trump to put his name to it. And they then engaged in activities that were the scandal of the real estate community in Toronto, which is I think real estate communities tend to be pretty close-knit communities that the players all know each other. And there can be some people who are more fast and loose and less fast and loose. But the kinds of things he was doing were unheard of, unprecedented, and obviously fraudulent. And of course, the project came to a tremendous catastrophe, and a lot of small business people small investors who had no business being in the hotel business, which is what this was in the first place, and whom no one else would have tried to take money from. He took money from cab drivers and nurses, and they all lost everything. In one of the, at a time when basically you got a chimpanzee, put a blindfold on him, had him throw darts. You could not lose money in Toronto real estate in the years between 2003 and 2007. But Trump managed it, but he didn't lose. Because he was just a hired employee of these fly-by-night operators. But many other people who couldn't afford their losings lost them. So the idea that the Trump operation as a business has always been foul, and there have always been a lot of questions. When people say, how did he get, well, this looks like a political charge that it came against him at last. I think the story of Trump as a businessman is it looks like something very peculiar happened that prevented him from being prosecuted for the years and years and years. And if you're looking for where did we deviate from the norm of law enforcement, it wasn't when Trump was finally brought to book for his many frauds. It was those years when he wasn't brought to book for his many frauds. And again, I don't want to make accusations because I don't have information and I don't have any proof, but it is odd Look, if you did in New York real estate what Trump did between 1989 and when he entered politics, you would be unlikely to escape the attention.
Well, it certainly would have helped our political case if the legal case had been prosecuted prior to 2016, because then there wouldn't be the illusion of a political witch hunt. Why? I mean, I'm blind as to what you might be pointing to in your speculation there.
Look, unfortunately, and I speak here, this is one of my Canadian views, local prosecutors in the United States are elected. And I think that's a very bad system, but it's the way it is. Elections cost money. If you are going to run for election and re-election for local prosecutorial office, you need to get money from people. And oftentimes, it's not supposed to come with favors attached, but oftentimes, and I'm not pointing any fingers at any specific person, but oftentimes favors are attached. And when you are trying to make sense of strange things that prosecutors do, and especially they don't do, one of the lines I wrote about Trump in one of my early articles about him back in 2017 was that the benefit of power in a modern bureaucratic state is not the ability to persecute the innocent, but the ability to protect the guilty.
Right.
And that is sort of a fact of life of a lot of America. But when some of the guilty people are protected, then go on to actually take the power for themselves. That's even before what happened in 2021 on January 6th. One of the things that was so alarming about Donald Trump as president was he was someone who had a big interest in perverting the legal system of the United States because his own record was so bad that he was simply in danger. If we had honest law enforcement, he would always feel in danger.
Electing prosecutors, electing judges. I'd forgotten about it. It's such a bizarre American tick. It's extraordinary.
It's incredible.
So all of these editorials against Biden, let's just go back to and close the loop on Biden before we get to Trump and the future of the Republican Party. I understand the frustration that people in the Biden administration must feel about all of these people coming out against them. At the same time, it's fully within their control to do something about that, which is for Biden to step down or to announce that he won't be seeking re-election. To blame the New York Times and other prominent outlets or Democrats for turning on him because they're giving fodder to Trump strikes me as an inversion of moral responsibility. It's like a drunk driver who's speeding along and the passengers in the back seat are saying, you should stop driving. And he says, if you don't stop distracting me, we're going to have an accident. Just let me drive. Just let me speed drunk.
Right.
Like you're the one speeding drunk. Stop speeding drunk. It's reckless. Get out now. Yes, we're shouting, we're screaming, we're trying to flag down the police cars going by so they'll catch you, but don't blame us for that. Just pull the car over.
It's an interesting. That's a very powerful analogy. It's an interesting game theory.
Yeah.
If everyone had pretended that everything was okay, Biden might have been able to get away with it. But once people stop pretending, then the act of no longer pretending that Biden is okay raises the price. And so there's now kind of a mutual hostage taking where Biden is saying, I won't go. At least at the time you and I are speaking, he's saying he won't go. And I'll take everybody down with me, but it becomes more and more certain that they will go down with him because more and more people are speaking up in more and more public ways.
Has it my sense is that it's reached a tipping point that the only prudent game theory move now is for everybody to pile on maximally because enough damage has been done. Like you can't have,
Yes.
you can't cut a baby in half. Like you can't pull back and be like, well, we wrote the editorial, but on the other hand, Donald Trump is really bad. I mean, if I were emperor of the world, I would just have everybody with any influence whatsoever screaming from the rooftops really hard and really fast. I was so disappointed in the week after the debate that there's still, there were editorials, but the world did not speak with one voice.
What was happening the week after the debate, I understand, is that this discussion was happening inside the House. And politicians would come out and say reassuring things in public, and they're saying stiff things in private. And then Biden seems not to have taken the message. And now the people who are speaking to him in private are now speaking increasingly.
I see.
And you and I are speaking half a day apart. But on what was my morning this morning, Nancy Pelosi was on a television program, the former Speaker of the House, where she kept insisting that Biden hadn't made up his mind yet, and the host kept pressing her, saying he's been pretty definitive that he's running. He said, "No, well, look, we will all respect the president's decision when he makes it, but he hasn't made it yet."
she might as well be wearing construction gear as she builds the off ramps for him that he could take. Yeah.
So we're in that drama.
Sorry, finish that thought.
And then the question is, what does the off ramp look like? Because normally you would say, well, the normal move that you would say is the president steps down and the vice president either inherits the nomination at the convention and runs in November, or even conceivably the president resigns and allows the vice president to run with all the advantages of incumbency, which are very real. But a lot of Democrats are unhappy with the idea of Kamala Harris, the vice president, as the leader too, and so now they're trying to execute this this is one of the reasons I've been sort of skeptical of this project, is the maneuver they want to execute is so complicated. Where Biden leaves, Harris somehow does not become the nominee. Somebody else about whom opinions differ somehow steps in a way that doesn't create acrimony and bloodbath and mutual recrimination, in a party, by the way, which plays identity politics in a very aggressive way. So it's not just that people will be elbowing each other. It's that there will be accusations of racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism and heightism. And it will get really nasty. And there isn't a lot of time for renewal and recovery and rebuilding.
I mean, we say there isn't a lot of time because the American political process moves so interminably and campaigns are so long. But in a country like Canada or Australia or, any other parliamentary democracy, you call an election and 4 weeks later, I mean, they just did it in France. They did it in the UK. You call an election, you quickly go to the polls, you figure it out. In Australia, we've ousted a prime minister 3 months before an election and put in another leader, and then they roll on. Like, there's nothing. It would be unprecedented for Joe Biden to step down, to resign today, and have a President Harris. That would be wild. But there's nothing unusual about a vice president not getting the nomination at the next term.
I just want to put in a small caveat here. It's often said by people in parliamentary systems that American elections are longer but it's not true. That in every democracy, the next election begins the day after the last one ends. It's just in parliamentary systems, because of the rules about campaign spending, there's a writ period where the election is open, and there's a pre-writ period where the election it's going on. I mean, that there is not a day from in any democracy, whether parliamentary or presidential, where people are not moving and angling and preparing for the next one.
Fair point. A fair point on the battle between the two parties. But I think what strikes non-Americans about the American political system is the interminable process of selecting the candidate within the party, which seemed to take a year. Like when people start throwing their hat in the ring before the New Hampshire primary, that's a long time before an election. And you're right, that's not happening. That's happening informally in some way in parliamentary systems because, of course, people are watching the opposition leader to see what their polling is like. But you don't have this clown car cavalcade of people all getting up and debating to try to figure out who the opposition leader is going to be.
You do, not to be pedantic about this, but you do it more. I would say right now in Australia, if I were to say who's going to be prime minister in 20 years, a politically not knowledgeable person could produce a list of 40 people that it's likely to be one of. And that there are people who are already active in one of the political parties. They've won their first race, or they're preparing to. They were active in campus politics. It's very seldom that people come out of in fact, people come out of nowhere. Barack Obama was a much more unlikely president than most of the last prime ministers of Canada.
Definitely,
yeah. But we also have this, the parties here, it's a vast continental country, and you're building coalitions all the time. And the Democratic Party especially is a coalition party. So you're having to do these negotiations. And we didn't have until quite recent, the parties weren't even really fully national until a long time. And one of the data points out. Everyone's heard the phrase the Republican National Committee, the Democratic National Committee. These are the center organizing. The Democratic National Committee didn't own a building until after the Second World War, and the Republican National Committee didn't own a building until after the First World War, because these were not permanent institutions. These were places where people met. The power was in the states. And every 4 years, the state parties would get together and come to a kind of treaty about how the power would be allocated and find somebody who was acceptable to enough different groups in this vast continental nation. And this is the process that now, if Biden does step down, Democrats have to do at blinding speed. And the other great issue is in a parliamentary system, there is continuous vetting. People run for the parliament. They rise through cabinet. Everyone in the political system knows their strengths and weaknesses. But there are a lot of capacity for surprises in the American system, and with the presidency, it's very dangerous to be surprised. So, Sarah Palin in 2008 can emerge and say she seems like a plausible person. She has a story to tell that she was, hockey mom, enters politics, becomes a reformist governor of Alaska, or that's how it's presented. And the idea that she was a vindictive, paranoid person, only a handful of people off in Alaska knew that. And as governor of Alaska, it's not such a problem that you're vindictive and paranoid, but as president of the United States with nuclear weapons, it would be.
I mean, the other problem is the fact that primaries are democratic. So the vetting process is across people who, by definition, don't know you personally. Whereas in a parliamentary system, the vetting process is conducted by people who actually, they're down the hall from you. It's your colleagues in Australian politics. I mean, different parliamentary systems do it a bit differently. Some, depending on who can vote for the leader of the party. But certainly, in Australia, it's impossible to be a psychopath and be elevated, or an ignoramus and be elevated to the top of the party, unless you were wildly charismatic or something. Because the people who are putting you there are not people who are just watching a debate and then going out to a town hall to engage in a caucus or a primary. They're your fellow party members. I mean, so yeah.
And the stakes are, and not to be disrespectful of the majesty and might of the Office of Australian Commission. If you put an absolute doofus in there for 2 or 3 years, the rest
we've
of the
tried
planet
that many times, David.
Yeah. And the rest of the planet, it was all right. If you put a doofus into this office, there are many seemingly miraculous moments in the history of the presidency, but maybe the most astonishing is the story of Harry Truman. And this is a way to think about what's happening right now. So President Roosevelt, of course, Franklin Roosevelt, runs for an unprecedented 4 terms. When he gets ready to run for the unprecedented 3rd term in November of 1940, that's when the election will be. There's other presidents. Ulysses Grant had thought about it. Woodrow Wilson, before he was felled by a stroke, had thought about it. But people had thought about it. Nobody had ever done it. Franklin Roosevelt actually did it. And it was quite shocking and disturbing, but it was on the eve of the most terrible war in human history. And in order to justify his 3rd term, he reconstituted his administration, and he recruited very prominent Republicans as Secretary of War, the man in charge of the Army, Secretary of the Navy, and he picked a Republican as his vice president, a man named Henry Wallace, whose father had served in the cabinets of the Republican presidents of the 1920s. And it was a famous name on the American prairie. He's very involved with American agriculture. And so he had this bipartisan look. My vice president is a Republican. The people who are going to be running the war that we're obviously on our way into are going to be Republicans. So I've reconstituted my administration. The problem is the man he's chosen as his vice president turns out to be a nut. I mean, a spiritualist, a crank, and an apologist for Soviet communism. And as we approach the election of 1944, where Roosevelt is obviously dying, important people in the Democratic Party say that you have to get rid of Henry Wallace. He's a crackpot. And not only is he a crackpot, but he's a crackpot who was a former Republican. So he may favor Republicans in the distribution of patronage. So you have to get rid of him. And maybe 6, maybe 8 men, and they are men, put the pressure on Roosevelt that you have to get rid of Henry Wallace at the Chicago Convention of 1944. And Roosevelt is a little reluctant, but he agrees. And he says, okay, I hear your point. He is a former Republican, and he's kind of a crackpot, and he's very soft on the Soviet Union. So we need to replace him. I like a man named Jimmy Burns, who's governor of South Carolina. And the 6 or 8 men on the committee say, we have 2 problems with Jimmy Burns. the lesser and the greater. The lesser problem is that Jimmy Burns is an extreme segregationist, and our party is beginning to depend more and more heavily on votes of black voters in the cities of the North, so we can't have a segregationist. The greater problem is Jimmy Burns was born Irish, raised a Catholic, and left the church to marry a divorced woman. And our Irish voters they're happy to vote for a Protestant who was born a Protestant, but they are not happy to vote for someone who started as a Catholic and left the church to become a Protestant in order to marry a divorced woman. Absolutely.
Apostasy.
No Jimmy Burns. We like Harry Truman. And Roosevelt said, I don't know. I don't like Harry Truman because he ran as a senator. He ran these committees that embarrassed me. I don't like him. And the 6 to 8 men said, we like him. And they got him. And the result is the Berlin airlift, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the whole structure of post-war peace. And if you get to think, was that the hand of God at work at that? But right now, the hand of God seems very...
Yeah, I mean, look, I take your point that I often have American friends who are more conspiratorially minded saying that, the problem is that the parties are too powerful and there are all these backroom deals and the people's voices aren't being heard, the people aren't being respected, there are these elite cabals who are controlling everything. And I'm like, actually, I mean, the problem, as far as I see it, one of the major problems with American politics is that the parties have no power. So there is not a party structure like there is in a parliamentary democracy where the party members can go, no, we're getting rid of, literally 3 months before an election. No, the prime minister is now fired. Here's your new prime minister. We'll take that to the people. There's no mechanism by which that can happen in the United States. So let's just map out the possibilities of if Biden were to announce that he wasn't going to run, right? So yeah, obviously Kamala would claim that she has a reason to be the nominee. Everyone's throwing around the other names that we've all heard a million times: Gavin Newsom, Gresham Whitmer, I don't know, Cory Booker. You throw in whoever you want. Why can't you just go to a convention? It's big, it's messy, it's mean. You come out the other side of it, and there is somebody partly wounded, but also partly kind of interesting, and like it can open It's Morning in America, like I am the generic candidate who's not Donald Trump window. Do you find that too Pollyanna?
I find it very scary. So in the days when we did have powerful conventions, so the conventions are important until the late 1960s. And the conventions really pick people until the middle 1960s. In those days, you would have a lot of what was a convention? So the delegates to a convention were people who got there by virtue of their positions in local parties. They were county chairs. They were people who were active in the party all year round, and they often were people who were very interested in patronage. So it was really, really important to them to win, because what they cared about a lot was the paving contract in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And they wanted to make sure that they were nominating somebody who would win the election, strengthen the tickets, and make sure that they brought in a Republican or Democrat president, governor, senator, so that they could dispense the paving contract the way they wanted to. They were in it for very practical reasons, and they made very practical choices. The delegates at this convention, there are 4,000 or so who will be at the Democratic convention, are political amateurs. They're in politics because it's interesting, because they like it, because they find it meaningful. They are typically, many of them will be from unions. They are not people who are thinking about the paving company.
Who are they, by the way, David? Who are they? So some of them are from unions. How do you get it? How do you get to be a delegate? And how do you get selected?
So, delegates. So it's a sweet gig. So the way it's been since like 1972 until maybe this convention is, the state party pays to send you to a national convention. You go there, you're wined, you're dined. And all these lobby groups, and they throw parties, you're taken out on yachts. And
sorry, just to clarify, when you say the state party, does that mean does that have anything to do with the governor or the representatives or senators of that state, or is that an administrative office?
Let me back up. So Joe Biden runs for renomination. So so there's a Biden slate of delegates in North Carolina. I forget how many people come from North Carolina, but there are three.
There are three people in North Carolina.
3 delegates.
No, total population of North Carolina. I'm joking.
I think I'm guessing is there 4,000 total delegates. So I'm guessing, let's say 20, 30 from North Carolina. So it's understood those people will have at the actual convention, their job is to say, yay, Biden, and by law and by contract, they're not there to make a decision. So how are they selected? It's a favor. It's a perk. And many of them, but probably I'm guessing a large proportion of them will come from unions, especially teachers unions. Some of them will be various kinds of state party officials. And then the Democratic or Republican Party of North Carolina will pay for their airfare and their hotel and send them to the convention. At the convention, the National Restaurant Association will have a party and they will be invited. And the National Brewery Association will have to charter a boat and they will be invited. It will be, and there will be shows and singers, and then they will hear speeches, and people will make much.
I'm sorry, David. Where is the application form for me to apply for this position? Can you send me a link?
It's a reward for years of good service to the party, but the person is here for psychic rewards, and where this is dangerous is that person's predecessor of 1952 was there for material rewards. The person of 2024 is there for psychic rewards. And the result is that means is when we have a battle at the convention between a black woman and a gay man and white conservatives, and they're not going to be thinking as their predecessors of 1952 were thinking, I don't care who you are, blue, purple, white, I am interested in that paving contract. And I am looking for the person who is going to give me my best hope of delivering. I'm not here for self-actualization. I'm not here for self-realization. I'm here for business. And I'm going to make a business-like decision. And so conventions often converged on the most electable choices. I worry that if you do this today with the delegate list of today, I mean, they will say they're thinking about electability, but there will be recriminations and identity politics. And the Democratic Party, which is an unstable grouping anyway, could break.
David, I don't quite follow. Why would a system of patronage necessarily yield an electable candidate any better than a system of immaterial rewards would? In both cases, you're picking someone because of some transaction that they can do for you, which may not correlate to their electability.
Because if you're there for material rewards, you're very concerned with electability. Because
because they have to be elected in order to give you the thing.
Yeah. Like you're not going to make a point. You're not going to say, look, I'm Catholic, but I'm only taking a Catholic, and I won't accept a Protestant.
But what I meant was there could be a candidate who promises to shower a lot of things on a lot of people who is not electable, and a more electable candidate who's more restrained in what he can offer.
The promises in the olden days, the promises were not usually delivered by the person. The president didn't get you the paving contract. There's a famous story about Franklin Delano Roosevelt where someone's running for the state assembly in New York, and he's mad at the party because the party's not putting enough effort into a state assembly race. And he goes to the party boss and says, "You're not spending anything. You're not sending any volunteers. You're not doing anything for me." And the boss asked him, "Have you ever been down at the foot of Wall Street when the Staten Island ferry comes in? And if you look at the ferry, behind the ferry, there are all these orange peels and pieces of litter and garbage and shit following in the wake of the Staten Island ferry. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the Staten Island ferry, and you are the orange peel."
Okay, that's nice. Then the final question about this would be, if it sounds like you're suggesting that if you removed identitarian politics from the equation, like you've proposed that there are two motivating functions that would occur to delegates, that you have the old function of kind of a patrician material incentive, and you have the new one of this kind of lofty whining and dining, shit-eating grin bunch of people who are chasing some ineffable sense of their own worth. Isn't there also, and maybe I'm naive, a sense that we have to win this election, and it may actually be that the woman of color is not the best person to win the election, and the straight white male is?
It might be. Look, again, I'm not going to pretend to have the answer to this in my back pocket. I know that the reason that Biden is president and Hillary Clinton wasn't was because he ran much better among men than Hillary Clinton did. He ran better than any Democrat since Bill Clinton among men, and not that he got a majority of men, but he narrowed the gap dramatically against what it had been in 2016. Also, I think what I worry about is I don't know who the best candidate is. I really don't. But what I worry about is that when the Democrats make that choice, they will not be thinking about really who is the best candidate. They'll be thinking about their particular.
Sure. Does it matter, though, David, who is the best candidate? I mean, the United Kingdom just voted for a block of cheese on a stick in the form of Keir Starmer. You need a generic Democrat who can just be a face, who can talk and hold a thought for more than 10 seconds, which the current president can't.
Keir Starmer was a great candidate. Keir Starmer said, my predecessor built a bomb that blew the Labour Party of Great Britain to pieces. And my job here is to disentangle that bomb. So I am going to fly to Estonia and put on a military jacket and stand there, be photographed troops to say, I don't hate the troops the way my predecessor did. And I'm going to go to Remembrance Day ceremonies and put on a poppy to say, which Jeremy Corbyn would never do. And I'm going to wear a necktie when I pay respects at the cenotaph. And I'm going to go to the Jewish community and say, I am not for people who want
These are pretty low bars, David. Like, visit the troops, put on a tie, and don't be an anti-Semite. I mean, the man is not a charismatic man. He is coming,
times 30. You go through the list. So the challenge here is not that these are so difficult, but it's also, you have to live in truth about your party's problems. And that's the thing that parties find very difficult to do. Why did we lose the last election? Parties do not like to tell themselves the truth about why they lost the last election. And so good leaders in the Keir Starmer position are people who are willing to face unwelcome facts. And facts, maybe the facts are not so unwelcome to Keir Starmer personally, but they are able to persuade a party. Many of these facts are unwelcome to important parts of the Labour Party. And then Keir Starmer did something very brilliant and very ruthless, which is the Jeremy Corbyn left said to him, for every vote you gain at the center, you're going to lose a vote on the left. And indeed, he got 34% of the vote. The left was right. Keir Starmer said I'm going to build a voting model that tests whether a vote on the left is worth as much as a vote on the center. Because the way our political voting system works, the United Kingdom has its own version of the Electoral College, that the votes I'm picking up are going to translate into more seats than the votes I shed. And so he got this very low percentage of the vote, 34, and this extraordinary percentage of the seats. And I don't think that happened by accident.
I'm not saying he wasn't a good political strategist. I'm saying that the Conservatives were so unpopular that you could have run anyone in a suit who was passable and they would have beaten Rishi Sunak.
They ran Jeremy Corbyn twice. These parties often make very unhealthy, self-destructive decisions.
Just to clarify what you're saying, I'm saying generic bland suit with a block of cheese stuck on its head beats an unpopular candidate. You seem to be saying you can't even trust parties just to nominate a suit with a block of cheese on its head, because sometimes they make mistakes and nominate people like Jeremy Corbyn, who I would say is much worse than a block of cheese on a stick, because he's toxic and alienating in many ways.
The great strategist of war, Von Clausewitz, has this observation about war that applies to politics. Everything in war is very simple, but the simple things are very hard. Right now, if Nikki Haley were the Republican nominee right now, the Republicans would be cruising toward an historic victory. And probably if somebody else other than Joe Biden were the Democratic nominee, someone Keir Starmer like, someone broadly acceptable, the Democrats would be, because the economy is fantastic in the United States and the record of the administration. They have many positive things to tell about their story, and they're running against this Trump figure who's never gotten more than 46, 47% of the vote. But why can't parties do that? Because although it's simple, it's hard. And I've spent a lot of time in the company of politicians, and the work they do, I really respect it. People make all kinds of comments about them, a block of cheese. It's really hard. Just to be average at it is really hard. To be good at it is fantastically difficult. And there's a reason that the people who are more than good at it, we build statues for them, because the work is so important and it's so difficult. And we all think we know better, but that's only because there are so many aspects of the problem that we don't see. When people come up and say, I have the strategy that is going to win, I have the speech the president should say, it's because they are thinking of the electorate as being made up of people who are like them. They write what they would like to hear. And they don't understand the job of the politician. What do politicians do for a living? In my opinion, what a politician is a specialist in the gaining of democratic consent. And that means working with millions of people who are very different from each other, may not like each other, who have, but at a minimum have certainly very different interests, and building some kind of workable system that can generate a functional either plurality or majority where people say, okay, this is good enough for me. And that is really hard.
I mean, to clarify, when I talk about a block of cheese on a stick, I'm not saying that that's what politicians are. I'm saying that when you have an unpopular candidate, that's all a politician needs to be in order to defeat the unpopular candidate. And when I sound like I know better than the system, that's not because I think that I could work better inside the system or that I would know how I could get people to govern better. It's I'm articulating what I think is a common understanding that there is something broken about the way that the system is working that is not selecting for the best people. There's something about the presidential selection process that isn't selecting for the characteristics that I think is necessarily going to favor the best president. Yes, it's really hard. So structure the system in such, mine is not a personal attack, it's a structural attack. It's like, why is the system such that we find ourselves in a situation where we have a crazed populist criminal running against a man who can't hold a train of thought for more than 10 or 15 seconds? Like, what out of 350 million people?
Yeah. Why did Trump win the nomination in 2016? So, the United States had this horrific economic crisis in 2008. At the same time as it was emerging from a war that was frustrating and disappointing, pair wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that were frustrating and disappointing, and where people felt they had not been given honest explanations of why the country was going to war in the first place. And the Republican Party that had been in power through both these frustrating wars and through this economic crisis lost, and then moved to the right. John McCain was the nominee in 2008, and he was a reformer of various kinds. Then the party went through the 2010 Paul Ryan movement, where they moved to the right and they prepared to nominate Jeb Bush, the brother of George W. Bush. So you had a party whose members were signaling what we want is less immigration, more healthcare, and no more Bushes. And the party said, right, we're radicalizing. What we're going to give you is more immigration, less healthcare, and one more Bush. And everyone who could write a check in the Republican Party said, that sounds like a good plan. And Donald Trump had the audacity and the vision to say, they want less immigration, more healthcare, and no more Bushes. I'm going to be that guy. So how come no one else saw that? Well, other people saw it. They just couldn't execute because you had to get the checks written. You had to go through a miasma of conventional ideas. Why was Joe Biden the nominee in 2020? Because through elite American opinion had moved sharply to the left since 2014, the Great Awakening, as it's sometimes called. You often talked about that. And then we went through the events of the summer of 2020, and a lot of people in the Democratic world convinced themselves that what the country needed was more immigration, fewer police, more racial preferences. And Biden was the one guy who, he sort of signed up for that program, but he was obviously the laggard, and he obviously didn't fully internalize it and didn't really mean it. He was going along with it, but he was doing he was the guy who was moving slowest and least enthusiastically down this road. And so the voters in the Democratic Party said, okay, that, he's someone who looks like, the American majority and not like the most fanatical elements of our party. These are difficult things to do. And credit to the people who do them. And again, it's all these things there. And even when people make mistakes and seemingly obvious mistakes, it's easy for us to remark them, but actually to be in the arena and trying to pull the levers and move the hawsers and to get the craft of state to move in this other direction.
No, I get it. That's why I make the distinction between criticizing people and criticizing the way that the systems are set up and the kinds of virtues that they're selecting for. Even just look at a presidential debate and ask yourself, obviously there's something. A debate is not selecting for characteristics that are necessarily most needed when something blows up in the Baltic Sea in the middle of the night, and you want the person to be a wise sage who can figure out what to do next. You said parties need to learn from the mistake of their last election loss. What's the lesson for the Democrats from the Clinton election loss in 2016 that they might be able to use today?
They have not. The lesson from the Clinton election loss was the power of the immigration issue, but they didn't want to learn that lesson because that violated too many party taboos. And so they responded by doing a lot of other things, everything other than, and this is one of the reasons they're in so much trouble in 2024. They said, right, Trump is about trade, which he really was. He talked about that too, but that was not the powerful issue for him. And so the Biden administration followed Trump on trade. They followed Trump on other kinds of issues, but they did not follow him at all on immigration. And that has been, I think, one of the puzzles of the Biden administration is the economic record has really been solid. We have now the tightest labor market, at least since the late 1960s, arguably since World War II. You would think that would lead to the reelection of the president, but it's not, because the tight labor market joined to weak enforcement of the border has led to a huge influx of immigrants. And I don't want to denigrate these people, or they're behaving in a way that, from each and every one of their points of view, makes total sense, and in fact, it's often very heroic. They're seeking a better life. The American job market has blaring this message to the world: we're hiring. You get here, you can have 3 jobs. We are hiring, and the border's open, so people come. Who can blame them? We do the same in their shoes. But the effect of each of those individual decisions to come means millions of people are coming, and people have not only a sense of too rapid social change, but also a sense that the society's not in control. The border's open. People feel unsafe. They feel threatened. They feel like the authorities aren't in charge.
I mean, I was still living in New York in 2016, and my recollection of the problems on the Democratic side are not that people were talking a lot about immigration. I mean, obviously, I understand what you're saying in the sense that Trump broke that taboo and offered an alternative, and that's a positive reason. That's a positive explanation for Trump's win. But if we're looking for a negative explanation of Clinton's loss, then I would throw into the mix the sort of lazy selection of a not particularly popular candidate on grounds of seniority, even though that candidate couldn't really articulate in a Bill Clintonian or Obama-esque way the stakes of the election and the aspirations of the American people, a candidate who seemed wooden and a little bit detached and lost. And I fear that same mistake is being made now on the Democratic side.
Well, except a lot of people think that if the Democrats had picked Joe Biden in 2016, who was also defined by seniority, who also was kind of wooden, they would probably have.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. He wasn't quite as wooden and quite as senior and quite as inevitable and quite as smug as Clinton seemed that year.
Well, then we get into one of the reasons as I say, I remain to this day a registered Republican. I spent my life in the Republican Party. One of the things I remark about the Democrats, and one of the things I'm worried about the convention, is they're not determined enough about gaining and exercising power. So if you ask many Democrats, why did Hillary Clinton lose when Joe Biden won? They was, well, it's obvious. She's a woman, and you lose 2 or 3 points for being a woman. So you believe that? You believe that you lose 2 or 3 points for nominating one? Yeah.
I don't know. I think it would depend on the person. But anyway, carry on.
Well, let's say you believe. You just said that. My hypothetical Democrat. You said you lose 2 or 3 points for being a woman. So why did you nominate a woman? Said, well, because what we wanted to do was we thought we could scold people into voting for if you know there's a discount for certain features, if you were a ruthless organization about gaining and exercising, look, I don't approve of these attitudes toward women. I don't endorse them. I don't share them. But I recognize that some millions of crucial voters who I need do share them. And therefore, I'm going to accommodate that in my political thinking. I mean, if you discover that more people like hamburgers than like seafood, and you're trying to build a chain of fast food restaurants, you want to be the biggest fast food company in the world, you sell hamburgers, not seafood. Even if you personally are a pescatarian.
Right, but then you would just never get a female president.
You would you might get one along the way, but what you would do is you would think, my job here as a gainer and exerciser of power is not to improve society. My job is to gain and exercise power in order to use that power to along the way improve society, of course. But first, we have to win the election. And that's one of the reasons I worry so much about this hypothetical open Democratic convention. I worry that people say things like, well, look, we have data that shows that candidate X or candidate Y is at a disadvantage. Can you internalize that into your thinking and not use that as an excuse to scold voters for not making better choices? The voters are the voters. And they are going to behave in all kinds of irrational ways. And especially at this juncture, faced with the alternative that Donald Trump is offering of someone who wants to wreck the American Constitution, overthrow elections by fraud and by violence, you need to be very clear-eyed about what you're doing and make decisions in a very unsentimental way. Not the decision you make for an electorate of one, but the decision that you make for an electorate of people not like you.
Sorry, we just had a broken connection. I didn't mean to interrupt. I heard someone say that if you were focused exclusively on electability, the Democrats should nominate Mitt Romney as their candidate. Because Democrats would vote for him, right? And Republicans would vote for him. There's no way Donald Trump can beat Mitt Romney if Mitt Romney is the Democratic candidate for president. So stick that in your pipe and smoke it.
I think one of the lessons, remembering that Mitt Romney and Donald Trump are, I think, exactly the same age. The lesson is we should all be Mormons, or at least.
Yeah, exactly. So assuming that Joe Biden doesn't step down, then what did you make of his? I mean, look, I hear so many apologists saying everyone has a bad night at a debate. It's understandable. Obama lost the first debate against Mitt Romney. Trump lost the first debate against Hillary Clinton. These things happen. But I think it's important why you lose the debate. I mean, if you lose the debate because you had a poor performance, that's one thing. But if you lose the debate because the top of your head pops off and a gremlin comes out and says, I am actually in control of this candidate and I will only get worse and worse as time goes by. In other words, if you reveal something that seems to be disqualifying about yourself, and I think that's what happened. And so now I'm curious about your optimism still about Trump losing when people, I mean, can the campaign even show this man in public? Do they have to just lock him up for the rest of the campaign?
You make a very powerful point. Look, incumbent presidents historically always do badly in debates, and especially the first debate. Gerald Ford did badly when he was the incumbent, did badly against Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter did badly against Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan in 1984 had two debates. The first was epically terrible. George W. Bush, who was just 58 in 2004, did so badly in his first debate that smart people made ads suggesting that he had succumbed to pre-senile dementia. Barack Obama, one of the great speakers of our time, and why is that? So the president's busy. The president finds the whole thing he's the president. He's been surrounded by accolades. He finds the whole process kind of demeaning and not worth his time. He also thinks no one understands the problems that he's faced and how hard he's worked and all the things he's done. And he gets a little impatient and testing, and he won't prepare, and he just won't. He does, even if he thinks he's making time, he never makes enough time. And the staff has become very deferential to him over 4 years. And so no one will tell him that you're doing a bad job in debate prep. And so there's a pattern, but that's not what happened with Joe Biden. I mean, obviously we are seeing here, and that the answer to it was to say, look, quite elderly candidates can win re-election. I point often to the example of the German election of 1959, where Konrad Adenauer, who was the great hero who built democratic West Germany, he was 81 when he ran for re-election in 1959. And he couldn't speak very well at that point either. And they just kept him on. TV was very new in Germany. They kept him off TV. He didn't do a lot of appearances. And they just stressed, look, it's been 10 years. Does everyone like the results? Everyone likes the results. The country was like rubble when he took over, and now you're buying motor scooters and buying cars and beginning to prepare for vacations in Italy. And the Christian Democrats, his party, ran an election on the slogan "Keine Experimente," no experiments, and he won the biggest majority in West German democratic history, in German democratic history. So I think the campaign you would have run is not to let Biden debate. It's just to make him a benign, avuncular presence, lots of negative ads on Trump, lots of ads about what has been accomplished. But now the gate's open because now everyone is saying you have to compensate for your inability to think fast on your feet by doing a lot of events where you think fast on your feet.
I mean, is it even just
And
thinking
that's kind of
fast on your feet? It strikes me that the Konrad Adenauer 81-year-old, there's nothing wrong with having an 81-year-old president. I mean, this has not bothered me up until I saw the turning wheels of his mind on that debate stage, because if an 81-year-old is a sage, it's fine if a president just sits up there in his castle in the White House and, everyone else runs the government, but they come to him like a sage and they say, here's this problem. And he goes, okay, well, you're going to want to talk to the Undersecretary of Fisheries and get the ambassador to Estonia on the phone because this might impact the price of herring. And, the Estonians are going to be pissed. But because this guy has been around since the Declaration of Independence was signed and, he and George Washington hammered this shit out together, then that's fine if he's sort of slow and thoughtful. We didn't see slow and thoughtful. We saw extremely confused over a prolonged period of time. And this isn't a job where you get to choose your good days and bad days. So...
And he's never had a sense of humor. And now, when Ronald Reagan ran for re-election in 1984, he opened his opening speech, where he declared his candidacy. He said, I commit, despite my age, and I intend to campaign in all 13 states.
Right. Yeah. So I want to end on Trump and the Republicans. I just want to still get on Biden. I'm still somewhat confused. You think that if Biden doesn't do any more public appearances...
No, I think...
Or only does auto cue. To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.